How far are you willing to go to stand up for what's right? Far enough to put your reputation or even your own life on the line? Well, our topic today did just that. Not once, not twice, but on multiple occasions over the course of a very short life. Silas Soule first moved to Kansas as a teenager, became part of the Underground Railroad, and ran slaves north to freedom. And when it came time to arm himself and take on the border ruffians, Silas didn't hesitate. Later, when the war between the states broke out, he was commissioned as an officer in the Union Army. Served with distinction during the Battle of Glorietta Pass, and then, as the conflict continued to rage back east, Silas helped to protect the frontier from hostiles. At least he did, until Colonel Chivington ordered him to attack the peaceful village of Chief Black Kettle on a little tributary they called Sand Creek. You know, I'm often asked, out of all the historical figures we cover here on the Wild West Extravaganza, which ones do I consider to be personal heroes? Well, today we're going to discuss a man who, in my opinion, fits the bill to a T. Silas Soule may not be a household name, he may not be the subject of movies or dime novels, but I think you'll be pleasantly surprised and inspired by his story. So please join me today as we recognize a true American hero. One who wasn't afraid to spill a little blood if the occasion called for it, but at the same time was willing to sacrifice it all for what was right. And in the end, it was this integrity that cost him his life. We got a lot to cover today. We're going to discuss Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, the Colorado Gold Rush, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, and finally, the Sand Creek Massacre. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Silas Stillman Soule was born in Bath, Maine on July 26, 1839. His parents married 8 years prior, and over the course of the next decade, they'd have a total of 7 children, only 4 of whom would reach adulthood. And at one point, when Silas was still a child, they lived in a commune like a bunch of dirty hippies. Kind of. I'm being a little silly in saying commune, but I guess technically it was more of a community-ran farm. Several families all living together under one roof, eating meals at a common table, sharing in the toil and harvest. So yeah, commune, right? Either way you want to shake it, the Soules wouldn't stay there long. Ended up moving to the town of Chelsea, just outside of Boston, and it's there where Silas began mixing with the local Irish, developing a brogue he'd learned to easily slip in and out of for the rest of his life. And I assume also developing a taste for potatoes. I hear the Irish really love potatoes, that and whiskey. But yeah, all in all, Silas did have a pretty idyllic childhood. Just roaming the streets with his buddies, doing everything from flying kites to shooting marbles, raiding orchards, swimming, stuff like that. And each and every Sunday, he and his family would gather in the parlor and take turns reading aloud from various books and newspapers. One of their favorites was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Stowe, which, if you knew much about Silas's father, Amasa, probably didn't come as too much of a shock. You see, Amasa Soule was somewhat of an idealist, some may even say fanatic, especially regarding the issue of slavery. I mean, hell, he named his oldest son after the famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. And in time, Amasa would put these convictions of his into action. Actions that would have a very profound influence on young Silas, especially after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, I know I've discussed this on past episodes, but I do think it bears repeating. You know, a lot of people just don't realize that the Civil War did not spontaneously occur in 1861. Truth be told, tensions have been building for decades upon decades, really going all the way back to the American Revolution. And most of these tensions were centered around slavery. Not only was it a hotly debated topic during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, but several of the founding fathers like John Jay and Alexander Hamilton were themselves ardent abolitionists. And although slavery was initially swept under the rug, mostly in order to preserve the new republic, there were states making moves to put an end to the peculiar institution fairly early on. Pennsylvania, for example, adopted a statute in 1780 that provided freedom for every slave born after its enactment. Then, just 3 years later, Massachusetts would become the first state to abolish slavery outright. New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut followed, and by the year 1804, all of the northern states had already outlawed slavery. Now, before you get to sending those angry emails, yes, I am fully aware that some of these states did so incrementally. And there were still slaves residing in certain northern areas pretty much all the way up until the Emancipation Proclamation. No, not everybody from the South was a mouth-breathing Neanderthal, and no, not everyone from the North was an angel. I get it. History is complicated, it's full of nuance, and there are very rarely any easy or quick answers. But at least they were doing something, right? Whereas down south, they were making zero efforts to free the slaves. In fact, for the most part, they were doing the opposite and doubling down. As such, it wasn't long before you had an equal mix of slave states and free states, much in the same way that we now have red and blue states, both vying for control of the federal government. And like I just said, it just so happened that both of these factions were equally balanced when it came to elected representatives. At least they were until Missouri, which at that time was a slave territory, decided to apply for statehood, an action that threatened to tip the balance in the U.S. Senate. That's where the Missouri Compromise of 1820 came into play. Don't worry, we will get back to Silas Soule in just a moment, I promise, but I do think this is some very important stuff to put into context. So yeah, in a nutshell, the Missouri Compromise was an act of federal legislation that attempted to level the playing field. They agreed to admit Missouri as a slave state on the condition that Maine was also admitted as a free state. The act also prohibited slavery in the remaining territories north of the 3630 parallel. Skip ahead to 1854, and there was another piece of legislation that I mentioned a moment ago known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which pretty much repealed the Missouri Compromise by saying that citizens of these new territories, places like Nebraska and Kansas, could decide for themselves whether or not to be slave or free states, a little something known as popular sovereignty. Now, Nebraska was already settled. Its population was staunchly anti-slavery, so that just left Kansas wide open as a big question mark. As a result, both pro- and anti-slavery activists flooded into the territory, with both sides hoping to turn the whole popular sovereignty thing to their advantage. It was this volatile situation that became known as Bleeding Kansas. And one of the abolitionists who flocked to Kansas looking to make it a free state was none other than Silas's father, Silas Soule. He and the oldest boy, William, joined up with the Immigrant Aid Society and arrived in Kansas City in late November of 1854. From there, they pushed west to Lawrence and built a small cabin alongside Coal Creek. Meanwhile, a then 15-year-old Silas began working in a Boston factory to support his mother and sisters. No word on whether or not this was a bean factory, but I suspect it was. Either that or a place where they made hockey sticks, maybe. I don't know. Or bagpipes. And yeah, those are pretty much all the stereotypes I know about Boston. Now, they wouldn't head west themselves until the following year, and by that point, Amasa was already balls deep in the Free State movement. Also, the violence was just getting started. That November, an abolitionist by the name of Charles Dow was shot dead, and it was his death that would lead to a series of larger and more violent confrontations. Hell, things got so hairy that Silas and his brother joined up with the local militia. Matter of fact, there's a very good chance that Silas was one of the men who rode with Captain Samuel Walker as he led a series of attacks across Kansas during the summer of 1856, culminating in the capture of Fort Titus. Full disclosure, but that is pure speculation on the part of historians. While we do know for a fact that Silas was absolutely a member of Walker's militia, we don't know when he joined or how many of these actions he was personally involved in. You know, I see and hear a lot of references about Silas developing into a very feared gunman during this period, and taking part in more than a few violent scrapes of the Missourians, but unfortunately, I'm just not aware of any known specifics, at least not regarding the summer of 56. Now, later on during that summer, his mother and sisters all got sick and headed back east to recover, leaving the Soule men to their own devices. Silas would later say of this period, quote, "I miss my mother and sisters very much, but I delighted in the life of a bachelor. With the girls gone, my father, brother, and I were free to take shits with the door open, go riverboat gambling whenever we pleased, talk about pussy, and make beef jerky to our heart's content. In short, we had the time of our lives." End quote. And no, that's not true at all. I mean, for all I know, it could be true, but mostly I just felt like bastardizing a quote from Step Brothers. That movie never gets old. Now, in all actuality, Silas, William, and Amasa spent their time sans ladies, just improving the cabin. That and becoming more and more involved in the chaos of Bleeding Kansas. Amasa was elected as a delegate to the Leavenworth Constitutional Convention, while Silas and William continued riding with the militias. They also went ahead and opened up their home to the Underground Railroad, which, just FYI, was not a literal railroad under the surface of the ground, as I thought it was for a good chunk of my childhood. Just a big tunnel under the cities where slaves were transported via secret and super quiet locomotives. What can I say? There's a reason Mensa never came knocking on my door, alright? Now, in truth, the Underground Railroad was just a nickname given to a loose network of people in safe houses who aided slaves escaping from the South. Totally illegal, by the way, and in direct violation of the fugitive slave laws. It could also be pretty damn dangerous. Case in point, In January of 1859, one of Silas's buddies, Dr. John Doy, got caught trying to escort around a dozen slaves north to Iowa. They were barely 10 miles outside of Lawrence when they were apprehended by a group of Missourians and locked up in the town of Weston. Later, they'd be transferred to St. Joseph, where Dr. Doy was sentenced to 5 years in the Missouri State Pen. And there's a very good chance he would have set out the entire 5 years behind bars had it not been for our very own Silas Soule. He and 9 of his buddies rode into St. Joseph on July 23, 1859, just 2 days shy of Silas's 21st birthday. And upon arrival, they scattered throughout the town, just trying to blend in and prepare for what was coming. As for Silas, all that time spent among the Irish served him well. He went to the jailhouse with that thick Irish brogue of his, posing as a traveler and claiming to have a letter for Doy from his wife. Not only did Silas charm his way past the guards, but he was able to personally hand the letter over to the doctor, all while making careful observations of the jail's interior. The note, by the way, was not from Dr. Doy's wife. It simply read, "Be ready at midnight." And it worked. Later on that night, shortly before 11 p.m., Silas and his companions gained entry to the jail, overpowered the guards, i.e. whooped their asses, and made off with the good doctor in tow. Sadly, the slaves that Doy was attempted to shuttle north were either resold or given back to their so-called masters. Per historian and biographer Tom Bensing, quote, "In July of 1859, Silas Soule turned 21. He had developed into a fairly handsome man with gray eyes and auburn hair. He had a bit of a baby face and was about average in height, in the mid-5-foot range. Silas had been running fugitives since he was 17 or 18, was a member of the local militia, and was readily picked by James Abbott to play a role in the Doy rescue. No doubt all of this, plus the daily living in a virtual war zone on still basically undeveloped prairie, gave him a strength of character and toughness that was belied by his wit, charm, and sense of humor. Little did he know that his character and performance in the Doy rescue would lead him to help in another rescue. One of Kansas's most fanatical abolitionists and a family acquaintance, John Brown, had allowed his obsession to carry him to one of the most extreme and nation-changing acts in American history." End of quote. Ah, yes, old John Brown. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume you're probably already familiar with the man, but just in case, I'll do a very quick summary. Born in May of the year 1800, Brown was of the belief that not only was he an instrument of God, but that he had a sacred obligation to put a stop to slavery. And much like the Soules, he too was involved with the Underground Railroad. Matter of fact, Brown's credited with helping over 2,000 slaves make their way to Canada. He moved to Kansas in the mid-1850s, just like the Soules, and almost immediately became a leader in the Free State movement. Only thing is, John Brown didn't really think his fellow abolitionists were doing enough to support the cause, especially after the sacking of Lawrence in 1856. As such, on the night of May 24th, he and a few of his like-minded associates decided to kick things up a notch and go on a little late-night murder spree. Their first victims, James Doyle and 2 of his sons, were members of a pro-slavery group known as the Law and Order Party, or at least they were until Brown and his buddies got a hold of them. They'd killed twice more before the night was over in what's now remembered as the Potawatomi massacre. And although Brown's bloodlust was temporarily satiated, he weren't quite done just yet, as evidenced by him trying to foment a literal slave rebellion just 3.5 years later. The famous raid on Harpers Ferry in present-day West Virginia would begin on October 16, 1859, and unfortunately for Brown, it proved to be an abject failure. Several of his followers were killed or wounded, and he himself was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. And once again, here comes Silas Soule to the rescue, allegedly. Legend has it that Silas gained access to the jail after pretending to be drunk and getting himself arrested. He met with Brown, much in the same way that he met with Dr. Doy over in Missouri, but Brown refused to be rescued, saying that his blood would, quote, "do vastly more towards advancing the cause as I have earnestly endeavored to promote than all I have done in my life before," end quote. So it were that a disappointed Silas simply returned home empty-handed. But is that what really happened? Well, we do know that Silas and John Brown were acquainted with one another. That much is a fact. According to Silas's sister Annie, they were close friends, and on at least one occasion, Silas moved some escaped slaves on Brown's behalf. But according to Silas's biographer, the great Tom Bensing, quote, "Unfortunately, there is virtually no other documentation of Silas's involvement with Brown. It does not appear that he took part in the military aspects of Brown's fight, most likely just crossing paths when Brown needed the Underground Railroad's help," end quote. As far as Silas trying to help Brown escape, it looks to me like the verdict's still out. Don't get me wrong, there were most definitely people looking to bust Brown out of the clink. More specifically, a group known as the Secret Six. The only question is, did they enlist the help of Silas Soule? According to Silas's brother William, they did. But according to his sister Annie, they did not. And per the aforementioned biographer, Tom Bensing, Silas was back home in Kansas at the time, helping to start a library. Now, with all that in mind, it's very possible that Silas's attempts to save Brown had been confused with another rescue that took place just a few months later, that of two of Brown's co-conspirators, Aaron Stevens and Albert Hazlitt. They too were arrested during the failed raid on Harpers Ferry, and just like Brown, they were sentenced to hang. And this time we do know for certain that Silas was involved in planning their escape. And we also know that this is the operation where he pretended to be a drunken Irishman in order to get himself arrested and thrown in the same jail as the men he was looking to set free. So you can imagine his shock when Stevens and Hazlitt refused rescue, just like Brown, telling Silas that they would rather die as martyrs. Thankfully, Soule was released the following day, and authorities were none the wiser as to his true identity or mission. And from there, he decided to do a little traveling. Headed up to Boston to see the Dropkick Murphys in concert. No, just made that part up. Actually, headed up to Boston and befriended the famous poet Walt Whitman. Visited with family up in Maine, spent some time in Philly and Pittsburgh, and finally, sometime during the spring or early summer of 1860, made his way back home to Kansas. Just in time to catch a pretty serious case of gold fever. Oh, and before I forget, before we go any further, I know I'm going to get corrected, so let's go ahead and discuss the pronunciation of Silas's last name. It's spelled S-O-U-L-E. I've heard people say it the way I've been saying it, Soule, and I've heard them pronounce it as Soule or even Soule. Hell, I've even seen some spellings in old documents where the E at the end has an acute accent. But according to the actual Soule family, I'm talking Silas's great-great nieces and nephews, it is pronounced Soule, okay? So if you've got any issues whatsoever with the way I'm saying it, take it up with them, huh? If you have additional information or you just want to tell me how horribly wrong I am with zero context, please feel free to hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com. Now, as I alluded to a moment ago, by the time Silas got back home to Kansas, his brother was making arrangements to head west to Colorado and strike it rich in the gold diggings. And Silas, ever the adventurer, decided to tag along. They ended up camping out in Leavenworth Gulch, some 30 or so miles west of present-day Denver. And it didn't take them long to figure out that prospecting wasn't nowhere near as easy as they figured it'd be. In time, William would return to Kansas as Silas found employment as a blacksmith. To once again quote Soule biographer Tom Bensing, by July, Silas began to question his future. The gold rush had not panned out, and Silas grew bored and impatient. He debated about greener pastures as his sense of adventure led him to talk of Nevada, California, and even South America. Silas would soon have a reason to come down from the mountains, as would many of the disgruntled miners, as a threatening menace clad in gray uniforms cast a shadow over the territory. End of quote. And yeah, just in case you missed that reference, that threatening menace clad in gray was the damn Confederate Army under General Henry Hopkins Sibley. Turns out a lot had gone down since Silas first arrived in Colorado. His father Amasa passed away in September of 1860, then just a couple of months later, Abraham Lincoln was elected as the nation's 16th president. Skip ahead another 5 months and shots are fired at Fort Sumner, and you know the rest. The nation had been tiptoeing around civil war for decades, and they finally went ahead and made things official. So it were that Silas joined up as a lieutenant with Company K of the Colorado 1st Infantry. He and his men marched south to New Mexico in February of '62, and in late March they'd fight in the Battle of Glorietta Pass, where Silas was recognized for being cool under fire. He and the regiment would head back to Denver that summer, at which point Silas was made acting adjutant to the district commander, a guy you've probably already heard of named John M. Chivington. The Ohio-born Chivington, a Methodist minister by trade, was commissioned as a major in the Union Army at the outset of the war. Much like Silas, he accounted well for himself during the Battle of Glorietta Pass, aka the Gettysburg of the West, and was soon promoted to colonel and given command of the entire military district of Colorado. And by all accounts, he was both loved and respected by the rank and file, including Silas Soule. Indeed, in a letter that Silas wrote to his sister in July of 1864, he mentioned Chivington, saying that he was a, quote, Methodist preacher, and whenever he sees me drinking, gambling, stealing, or murdering, he says he will write to Mother or my sister Annie, so I have to go straight, end quote. Obviously, Silas was being a little silly with his joke about murdering, but he truly did respect and admire Chivington. Chivington. Is it Chivington or Chivington? Chivington? I honestly don't know. I'm probably going to slip into both throughout the course of this episode, so sorry about that. But yeah, like I said, Silas respected and admired Chivington. Hell, he'd even signed a petition to have the major promoted, and in turn, Chivington tried to make Silas a lieutenant colonel. Neither of these promotions panned out, but it's still apparent that there was a mutual respect between the two. A mutual respect that would come to a very abrupt end in late November of 1864. We'll get to that soon enough, but in the meantime, Silas would be reassigned to Denver as an Army recruiter. We get to see a lot of Silas's personality coming out during this period, as his practical jokes often made the pages of Denver's Rocky Mountain News. And when Silas himself was the victim of such pranks, as he evidently was on April Fool's Day of 1863, they reported on that as well. Quote, "On April Fool's Day, many persons were sold in various ways, but I do believe the one with an E attached to his soul was victimized the most." End quote. You gotta think Silas was just barely approaching his mid-20s. Good-looking kid in the prime of his life, fairly intelligent, and with what appeared to be a promising career in the military. Dude was having the time of his life there in Denver. Not only did he have easy access to the theater, which he loved, by the way, and all the other attractions, but he also excelled at his job as recruiter. Apparently, the young lieutenant was a bit of a showman, oftentimes bringing the regimental band with him when he made the rounds to surrounding community just to stir up a sense of patriotic duty. Even Colonel Chivington was on record as describing Soule as the best recruiting officer that I know of. According to Tom Benson, this new job was a match made in heaven for him. It allowed him to tap the outgoing, charming side of his personality as he convinced people to see things his way. However, before he could fully immerse himself in the position, his family, and thus, by extension, he himself, would suffer a terrifying slice of hell. A devil who had once called himself Charlie Hart descended on the town of Lawrence and forever changed lives. End quote. Charlie Hart, of course, being the alias used by Confederate guerrilla William Quantrell. He and his bushwhackers attacked Silas's former home of Lawrence on August 21st, 1863. And if you'll recall, it's there in Lawrence where most of Silas's family still resided. Luckily, they were spared, however, and not among the nearly 200 dead. Now, Silas wouldn't learn of his family's safety for over a week after the attack. Initially, he wanted to be transferred to Kansas, but once he found out that his mother and sisters headed back east for safety, he decided to go ahead and stay put there in Denver. And it was also during this time that he possibly eloped with a pretty young widow by the name of Emma. I don't want to get too sidetracked here. Much like Silas's involvement with John Brown's escape, there's not a whole lot of evidence. But in November of the year 1900, a lady calling herself Emma Martin Bright Soule filed a claim for a widow's pension. According to Emma, she and Silas were married in November of 1863 by a justice of the peace. They lived together first in Central City, then in Denver until the spring of '65 when she traveled to visit her mother. And by the time she returned to Colorado, Silas was already, well, you know. Worth pointing out that Emma was not able to provide a marriage certificate or pretty much any other evidence that she and Silas were married. And when she was questioned by the pension department, they thought she was either lying or crazy and denied her request. And they may have been onto something. Turns out Emma was arrested a few years later and found mentally unstable. Nonetheless, she would continue going by the last name Soule all the way up until her death in 1935. Once again, per biographer Tom Benson, there is a good probability that they had some kind of relationship, but it's very unlikely that a marriage occurred. Emma was either a scorned woman or desperate for money. End quote. Interestingly enough, Benson then goes on to discuss Silas's weakness for the opposite sex and even provides evidence that at least one of these relationships possibly resulted in Silas catching a case of syphilis. At this point, I'm starting to think that damn near everybody had syphilis back in the Old West. Wrap it up, fellas. Now, following a couple of recruiting missions down to Fort Garland, Silas was promoted to the rank of captain and reassigned yet again, this time to Company D of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, and stationed at Fort Lyon. He'd report there in May of 1864, just as troubles with the Cheyenne were really beginning to ramp up. And when I say troubles, it's pretty much the same story we see repeated time and time again throughout the West. You know, it starts off with people from back east crossing native land. Then comes the prospectors and settlers, the army, and before you know it, these two vastly different cultures begin to clash. Now, back when people first started traveling through Colorado, pretty much the entire eastern portion of the territory belonged to the Cheyenne and Arapaho, per the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Or at least it did until the Treaty of Fort Wise a decade later that saw their land further reduced by around 90%. While several Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders did agree to these terms, not everybody did. Matter of fact, most bands did not, especially the more warlike factions like the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers. They continued to hunt and live pretty much wherever they pleased, and in time, they'd become more aggressive towards the settlers invading their territory. The Americans either couldn't or wouldn't understand that these western tribes weren't ruled over by one supreme leader like a president or a king. There wasn't just one chief or even a group of chiefs that could speak for the entirety of the Cheyenne Nation. Same thing goes for their allies like the Arapaho. Those opposed to the Treaty of Fort Wise claimed that it was signed by a tiny minority of chiefs without their consent, and that these chiefs either didn't fully comprehend what they were agreeing to or that they were simply bribed. As far as the U.S. government was concerned, those who refused to abide by the treaty were considered hostiles. Rumors began to spread that the Cheyenne and their various allies, including the Lakota and the Kiowa, were looking to drive the whites out of the territory entirely. Hell, there were even some who thought that the Cheyenne were looking to join forces with the Confederate Army. So yeah, needless to say, things were a mite tense there in Colorado by the time Silas arrived at Fort Lyon. And while the rumors of the Cheyenne joining forces with the Confederates proved untrue, they did begin committing relatively minor infractions like stealing livestock. Skip ahead to mid-April of 1864, and shots were fired between a detachment of the 1st Colorado, Silas's new unit, and a small band of Cheyenne who were caught stealing cattle from government contractors. The following day, Colonel Chivington wrote to the commander at Fort Lyon saying that the Cheyennes were, quote, stealing large numbers of stock and refusing to give them up, and there is but one course left for us to pursue. That is to make them behave or to kill them, which latter it now seems that we shall have to do, end quote. Not long thereafter, the army burned a couple of Cheyenne villages along the Republican River, followed by a similar attack near Cedar Bluffs. Finally, by mid-May of 1864, Lieutenant George Eyre located a group of Cheyenne in present-day Ellsworth County, Kansas, under the leadership of Black Kettle and another chief named Lean Bear, both of whom, by the way, were signers of the Fort Wise Treaty. Now, Lean Bear even had a peace medal from President Lincoln, in addition to a letter from Lincoln stating that he was a friend of the whites. Didn't matter, though. Colonel Chivington had given orders to attack the Cheyenne wherever they could be found, and that's exactly what L.T. Eyre did. And when Lean Bear approached with that letter from Lincoln, Eyre had him blown out of the saddle. The battle ensued, and had it not been for Black Kettle urging his warriors to stop firing, there's a very good chance that Eyre and his outnumbered troops would have been slaughtered. As it were, Black Kettle saved their bacon, and the soldiers returned to Fort Larn to lick their wounds. And it's skirmishes like these that just cause the more warlike members of the Cheyenne to lash out. And sadly, some of these warriors did take their frustrations out on innocent ranchers and settlers. One of the more well-known examples is the Hungate family, just north of present-day Elizabeth, Colorado. The entire lot of them were slaughtered, including 2 children, one of whom that was just 6 months old. Worth noting that their father Nathan had previously, and allegedly, shot a native who was trying to steal his stock, so it's thought that this attack on the Hungates was most likely motivated by revenge. Also worth noting that nobody knows what tribe, much less what band, committed these murders. As you'll soon hear, a lot of different tribes were raiding during this same time period. According to fur trapper Jim Beckwith, the attack did not have the usual earmarkings as being committed by either the Arapaho or Cheyenne. But then again, Beckwith was known to tell a lie or two on occasion. Either way, the people there in Colorado were outraged and calling for retribution, and the violence continued. Just to put things into perspective, in the year 1864 alone, prior to the Sand Creek Massacre, there were 32 recorded attacks there in Colorado committed by Native Americans. Attacks that resulted in the deaths of nearly 100 settlers, not to mention those who were wounded or taken captive. Somewhere between 200 to 300 head of livestock were stolen, ranches were destroyed, and at least a dozen wagon trains and stagecoaches were likewise attacked. And this shit did go both ways. As I've already mentioned, the army was targeting the indigenous whenever they could find them, even the peaceful bands like those under Black Kettle and Lean Bear. And when a friendly Arapaho chief named Left Hand approached Fort Larn under a white flag, looking to broker peace, he too was fired on by a damn cannon. As I'm sure you can imagine, this led to even more violence. Skip ahead to August 6th, and a group of Cheyenne dog soldiers killed some hide hunters near Salina, Kansas. Following day, a band of Kiowa under Chief Satanta attacked a wagon train north of Fort Lyon. Day after that, the Lakota launched an attack near Plum Creek, Nebraska, killing 11 men, burning wagons, and stealing nearly $8,000 worth of property and livestock. Then, just 2 days after that, there were even more attacks, both in Kansas and Nebraska. I could go on and on and on. As I'm sure you're starting to notice, it was not just the Southern Cheyenne. The Arapaho, the Kiowa, the Lakota, the Comanche, hell, even the Pawnee were all on the warpath. Suffice it to say, the summer of '64 was a bloody mess, and pretty much everybody, white and indigenous alike, were on edge. So much so that when a rider outside of Denver spotted a large group of horsemen, he rushed back into town and sounded the alarm. The distraught citizens began running from their homes, screaming and looking for safety, and a good deal of them spent the night huddled together in the few brick buildings there in Denver all the way till sunup. Turned out to be a false alarm. What the guy thought was a large war party was actually just a herd of cattle. The fear was real, though, and it spread like wildfire. Things got so bad that Territorial Governor John Evans declared martial law and even made a trip to D.C. looking for assistance. According to Tom Bensing, quote, "Finally, after continual lobbying of Washington, Evans received what he wanted several days later. In the absence of seasoned veterans, Colorado was given permission to raise a 100-day unit for defense." End quote. Now, I do not know how many regular troops were already stationed there in Colorado, like Silas, but it wasn't a lot. Just like down in Texas, most of the available men of fighting age had headed east to fight in the Civil War. And considering that the Army had their hands full with Johnny Reb, Chivington and Governor Evans would just have to make do with an all-volunteer militia. Now, oddly enough, the various raids and depredations began to slow down a mite come the fall of 1864. Matter of fact, that September, a pair of Cheyenne messengers arrived at Fort Lyon looking to make peace. Turns out they had a letter from Black Kettle, written by George Bent, and saying that if the Army released all of their prisoners, then they, in turn, would release all of their white captives. When these emissaries were asked whether or not they were nervous to approach the fort, considering that the Army was under orders to fire on them, they replied by saying that they knew, even if they were killed, that the soldiers would find Black Kettle's letter on their body, and that their deaths would be worth it if it meant that the Cheyenne soldiers could live in peace. Now, I don't care who you are, but that takes balls. A fact that certainly wasn't lost on the commander there at Fort Lyon, Major Edward W. Wynkoop. He'd later write that he felt himself in the presence of superior beings, and that these were the representatives of a race that I heretofore looked upon without exception as being cruel, treacherous, and bloodthirsty, without feeling or affection for friend or kindred. And yeah, the major was so impressed that he went ahead and made the executive decision, without consulting his superiors, to meet with Black Kettle in person. He, along with the newly minted captain, Silas Soule, and around 130 troops left Fort Lyon on September 7th, traveling to the chief's village in what's now north-central Kansas. And it wasn't just Black Kettle, by the way. There were other bands of Cheyenne, including dog soldiers, as well as a smattering of Lakota and Arapaho. All total, somewhere around 800 warriors versus Wynkoop's 130. Things were a little hairy at first, but the meeting did go relatively well. Not only did they refrain from slaughtering one another, which is always a plus, but Silas and the Major were able to retrieve 4 captives. What's more, Wynkoop offered to escort Black Kettle and a few of the other chiefs to Denver so they could meet with the governor, which he did. The only thing is, Governor Evans did not want peace. Not really. And this is where things really go off the rails. Like, the way this story is about to go is almost unbelievable. It's very hard to believe that people thought this way, but hey, it happened, and now we're going to talk about it. If you'll recall, Governor Evans had spent the better part of the summer pretty much begging the War Department to fund Chivington's all-volunteer regiment. And as crazy as this sounds, Evans felt like there would be political backlash if he agreed to peace so easily. And Chivington pretty much felt the same way. He too was planning on a career in politics when he got out of the Army, and he knew damn well that a decisive blow against the Cheyenne would only bolster his chances. And if he and Evans made peace like Black Kettle wanted, then they wouldn't get their chance at victory. Wasn't just that, though. You see, a lot of folks had taken to mockingly calling Chivington's regiment the Bloodless Third, on account of them failing to punish the aggressors. So for Chivington especially, it wasn't just about his future prospects as a politician. He was also dealing with a bruised ego. And a man with a bruised ego can be a dangerous thing. In the end, Chivington and Governor Evans told Black Kettle and the other chiefs that if they hoped to escape the wrath of the Army, then they and their people should surrender to Major Wynkoop at Fort Lyon. To their credit, the chiefs expressed a willingness not only to cooperate, but to also reach out to the other more aggressive bands and try to stop them from attacking settlers. They even offered their services to help the Army fight against other tribes such as the Lakota, Kiowa, and Comanche. Meanwhile, the killings continued, mostly over in Nebraska and Kansas. But hey, at least progress was being made, right? When Silas and Major Wynkoop made it back to Fort Lyon, Black Kettle and the others went off to locate their people and convince them to surrender. The If all went according to plan, they'd meet back up there at Fort Lyon, where they'd be under the Army's protection. According to Silas, in a letter that he wrote to his sister that October, quote, "We have had considerable trouble with the Indians this summer, but they are quite peaceable at the moment. There are about 3,000 here within a mile of the post who have come for the purpose of making peace. I do not know what we shall do, but I think the government will not make peace with them. If that's the case, we shall have some fighting to do this winter." End quote. And unfortunately, Silas was correct, at least in regard to the government not making peace. Hell, Governor Evans was so against the idea that he even had Major Wynkoop relieved of his command. The official reason was insubordination, but in all reality, like I keep saying, it wasn't peace that the governor truly wanted. He and Chivington were out for blood, and here was this Major Wynkoop guy doing his level best to deprive him of a career-boosting massacre, so he got the axe. And once Wynkoop's replacement showed up, Major Scott Anthony, and saw that Black Kettle and his bunch were flocking to the fort en masse, exactly as Chivington told him to do, he wrote the following to his superiors. "They, the Cheyenne, pretend that they want peace, and I think they do now, as they cannot fight during the winter, except where a small band of them can find an unprotected train or frontier settlement." End quote. And yeah, that's really what a lot of this was about. Most of these Great Plains tribes, like the Cheyenne or Arapaho, did the bulk of their fighting when the weather was more agreeable. Then come wintertime, they'd stock up on meat and pretty much just hunker down. Chivington knew that he'd have a hard time defeating the Cheyenne under optimal conditions, especially with an unproven militia. That being the case, his only hopes were to catch them in their winter camps with their pants down. And since winter was rapidly approaching, he damn sure wasn't going to waste such a golden opportunity by making peace. Now, in he and Governor Evans' defense, I do somewhat understand their skepticism. After all, it's always possible that Black Kettle and the others were only agreeing to peace to ensure that they'd remain unmolested throughout the winter. You know, when they were the most vulnerable. And then come springtime, they just go back on the warpath, peace treaties be damned. Okay, cool. But as I've already touched on, Chivington and Evans' misgivings had a whole hell of a lot more to do with their future political aspirations than it did the safety of their constituents. Now, Wynkoop's replacement, Major Anthony, did go ahead and meet with Black Kettle and a few of the other chiefs. He told them that if they gave up their arms and moved their people to Sand Creek, some 40 or so miles to the northwest of the fort, then he'd see to it that they were protected. And when Black Kettle expressed concerns about being so far away from Fort Lyon, Anthony suggested that he fly the American flag above his lodge just to signify that he and his people were friendlies. He then wrote to his superior over in Kansas, General Curtis, and admitted that he only agreed to Wynkoop's deal with the Cheyenne in order to keep them docile long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Simply put, Major Anthony sent Black Kettle to Sand Creek so he'd be a convenient target for Colonel Chivington. That may be a controversial take on my part. I do know that Anthony would later express remorse and even readily admit to the atrocities committed by his men, but hey, what's done is done. And I do think that letter to General Curtis is especially damning. Now, Chivington and his soon-to-be Bloody Third arrived at the ranch of William Bent on November 27th. They posted guards to prevent William from leaving and alerting his Cheyenne in-laws, and then took his son Robert, who was half Cheyenne, as a prisoner. A nearby rancher named John Powers, who was married to the daughter of an Arapaho chief, was likewise placed under guard and not permitted to leave his own property. And the following day, November 28th, 1864, Chivington and his men reached Fort Lyon. And upon arrival, he commandeered Anthony's troops to supplement his 100-day regiment, including our very own Captain Silas Soule. Per Tom Bensing, quote, he, Chivington, informed Anthony of his intention to march on Sand Creek and attack the Indians there. Anthony was unsure of the direction to take, considering the fact that Chivington was operating outside of his district. He also had doubts about whether or not the best course of action was to attack the Sand Creek bands, while the Dog Soldiers and other more warlike factions were at the Smoky Hills in Kansas and would be enraged into attacking settlers again. But the fighting parson, aka Colonel Chivington, convinced him that it was their best course of action. End quote. And once Silas and a few of the other officers learned of Chivington's plans, they began protesting to Major Anthony, reminding him that Black Kettle was under their protection. At one point, Silas proclaimed that any man who would take part in murdering peaceful natives was a, quote, low-lived, cowardly son of a bitch, end quote. And he certainly was not the only officer with such misgivings. One of his brothers-in-arms, Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, would even liken Chivington's planned attack as being akin to murder. Chivington responded to these protests by saying that he thought it was right and honorable to use any means necessary under God's heavens to kill the indigenous, and, quote, Damn any man that is in sympathy with the Indians. He then suggested that Soule, Kramer, and any other officers who were hesitant to act should just go ahead and get the hell out of the army. And yeah, later on that evening at around 8 p.m., over 700 soldiers departed Fort Lyon, including Silas and Kramer. Believe it or not, they were given the option to remain back at the fort. Why they didn't stay is anyone's guess. Perhaps Silas thought he could do more good in the field, maybe even change Chivington's mind at the last second. Maybe it was his sense of duty to his men, or maybe he believed Major Anthony's false promise of not firing on any of the quote-unquote good Indians. Now, like I said earlier, Black Kettle was camped at Sand Creek, about 37 miles north of present-day Lamar, Colorado. His village consisted of somewhere between 700 to 800 Cheyenne, as well as around 10 lodges belonging to the Arapaho. And since Old Man Winter was rapidly approaching, most of the men of fighting age were out hunting buffalo, leaving behind less than 100 warriors to defend the camp. And what happened next was an absolute slaughter. You'll often read that Chivington told his men to kill and scalp all, big and little, nits make lice. And while Chivington did indeed utter those words, it was during a previous speech back in Denver and not as he and his men were preparing to attack Black Kettle. That said, he would give similar orders, just not so blatantly. Per one of his own men, Morse Coffin, what Chivington said was, "Boys, I shall not tell you what you are to kill, but remember our slaughtered women and children." So yeah, not quite as catchy or foreboding as nits make lice, but the meaning was about the same. Chivington was letting the troops know that he wanted the Cheyenne to suffer in the same way that families like the Hungates had suffered. And sadly, that's exactly what ended up happening, only at a much larger scale. The butchery would commence at dawn and last all the way up until around 4 o'clock that afternoon. And when the smoke cleared, there were at least 100 natives dead on the ground, the vast majority of whom were women and children. I see at least 100, but estimates do vary quite a bit. If you search online, you'll find many a credible appearing article stating that the total number of dead was 230. There are other sources claiming that it was 148, and Colonel Chivington would admit to killing over 500. So where exactly does the truth lie? Well, the lowest number I found comes from an eyewitness, John Smith, who said that there were only around 70 or 80 bodies. Historian Alan Brinkley thinks it was closer to 130, and George Bent, who was living with the Cheyenne and present during the massacre, said that it was 137. Then, a few years later, he would change the total to around 160. Silas, in a letter to his mother, said that it was 300, but his fellow officer, Joe Kramer, thought that the number of dead didn't exceed 200. Truth is, nobody knows the exact number. I do think, though, just going off the available data, that at minimum it was 100, most likely more. I mean, God only knows how many people escaped who would die of their wounds days or even weeks later. As for our hero, Silas Soule, well, he refused to take part in the massacre altogether. What's more, his own men backed up his play. Once again, per biographer Tom Bensing, quote, "Many of the troopers of the Colorado First had seen the humanity of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. They had experienced the day-to-day interactions with men such as Left Hand and Black Kettle, both at Black Kettle's encampment and at Fort Lyon." He then goes on to write that Captain Soule, quote, "led his men onward, trying to avoid the crossfire and eventually spending the rest of the fight as spectators, moving up and down along the banks of the creek," end quote. Silas would later remember the massacre as follows. "It was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. One squaw was wounded, and a fella took a hatchet to finish her, and he cut one arm off and held the other with one hand and dashed the hatchet through her brain. One squaw with her 2 children were on their knees, begging for their lives as a dozen soldiers within 10 feet of them firing. When one succeeded in hitting the squaw in the thigh, she took a knife and cut the throats of both children and then killed herself. One old squaw hung herself in the lodge. There was not enough room for her to hang, and she held up her knees and choked herself to death. Some tried to escape on the prairie, but most of them were run down by horsemen. I saw 2 Indians holding one another's hands, chased around until they were exhausted, and when they kneeled down and clasped each other around the neck, they were both shot together." Guy I mentioned earlier, John Smith, would recall seeing the bodies, quote, "cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than any I've ever saw before. The women cut all to pieces and scalped, their brains knocked out. Children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from suckling infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops," end quote. Sadly, it didn't stop at just mutilations. Rapes were reported, and such indecencies weren't just relegated to those still alive, if you catch my drift. Others would report seeing women's breasts cut off and stretched over saddles or even worn as hats by the soldiers. Even Major Anthony would admit to witnessing atrocities. Said he saw a little girl, quote, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was behind following after him. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling in the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, "Let me try the son of a bitch. I can hit him." He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but missed him. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fella dropped. And yeah, Chivington and his volunteers were greeted as heroes when they returned to Denver. Hell, Chivington would even lead a parade through downtown while holding onto a pole with a live bald eagle tied to it, just flapping its wings in terror. Good God, man, this guy's like a fucking villain from a cartoon. Oh, and by the way, his men then began displaying the severed body parts of natives in Denver saloons. As soon as the celebration was over, Chivington sent a telegram to General Curtis over in Kansas, explaining his great victory against the Cheyenne, while at the same time snitching on Silas. Quote, "I cannot conclude this report without saying that the conduct of Captain Silas Soule, Company D, 1st Colorado Cavalry, was at least ill-advised, saying he thanked God that he killed no Indians, and like expressions, proving him more in sympathy with the Indians than with the whites." End quote. Of course, at the same time, Silas was writing letters of his own. One to his mother, where he stated, "I was present at a massacre of 300 Indians, mostly women and children. It was a horrible scene, and I would not let my company fire." He then went on to say that he saw little children on their knees begging for their lives, only to have their brains beaten out like dogs. He also wrote to his former commander, Major Wynkoop, describing the massacre and giving praise to Lieutenant Kramer. If you'll recall, Kramer was one of the ones who joined Silas when he complained to Colonel Chivington, and just like Silas, Kramer refused to let his men participate in the massacre. Now by this point, Silas had a little soul searching to do. No pun intended. He began debating whether or not to stay in the service, but in the end, he decided to remain, just not at Fort Lyon. He ended up getting transferred to Denver as an assistant provost marshal, which, if I'm not mistaken, basically means he was like an MP or military policeman. And although he was still held in high regard by most, there was a certain segment of the population there in Denver that didn't care for his actions at Sand Creek. Or I guess I should say his lack of actions. And these same people really didn't like him once Chivington was subjected to a military investigation. An investigation whose first witness was Captain Silas Soule. Silas would later confide to one of his fellow officers that he fully expected to be killed due to this testimony. And if Chivington didn't have him killed outright, he'd instead just try to destroy his reputation. Sure enough, there were death threats, and on at least one occasion, Silas was fired upon by unknown assailants. Not long thereafter, he was followed in a menacing manner by an angry mob, just barely escaping. But despite it all, Silas went on living. Not only did he continue damning Chivington and working as a provost marshal, but he also found time to fall in love and get married. And very fittingly, he and his young bride, a lady by the name of Hersa, tied the knot on April Fool's Day, 1865. One has to imagine that was a deliberate choice on Silas's part, considering his long history of playing pranks there in Denver. Little did he know he had less than a month to live. Sunday, April 23rd, 1865, started off normal enough. Silas and his wife Hersa spent the evening with friends, and then as they were on their way home, Silas heard gunshots in the distance, so he went to investigate. Moments later, as he reached the corner of what's now 15th Street, right between Lawrence and Arapaho, he came face to face with two drunks firing off their guns, one of whom was Private Charles W. Squire of the 2nd Colorado. They both recognized one another as Silas went for a little derringer he kept in his pocket, and with just 4 feet separating them, they opened up fire simultaneously. Silas's round hit Squire in the hand and caused him to drop his revolver, but unfortunately, he had already managed to squeeze off a round, one that struck Silas just under the right cheekbone. Squire and his buddy, a guy named William Moreau, ran away into the night as Silas, just 3 months shy of his 27th birthday, lay on the ground gasping his last breath. His funeral would be held just 3 days later, and he was laid to rest at Denver's Mount Prospect Cemetery, now known as Cheeseman Park. A few years later, he was reinterred to Denver's Riverside Cemetery, and it's there where he remains to this day. Now, his assassins, Squire and Moreau, they both fled Denver on the same night that Silas was killed. To this day, nobody knows what became of Moreau. He just sort of disappeared, but Squire was soon arrested down in New Mexico as a deserter. And according to him, Silas was the aggressor. Said that he and his buddy were just defending himself and that it was Moreau who fired the fatal round. Oddly enough, the guy who arrested Squire and brought him back to Denver, Lieutenant James Cannon, was himself found dead in his hotel room just a couple of days later, with the official cause of death being ruled as an overdose. And 3 months after that, on the night of October 9th, 2 mystery men entered Squire's jail cell, removed his shackles, and set him free. He'd drift around for a bit before moving back in with his parents in New York. It's there where he died of gangrene in December of 1869 after an on-the-job injury. Now, we'll circle back to Squire here in just a moment and discuss his possible motivations. But before we do, let's talk a little bit more about that asshole, Colonel Chivington. If I'm not mistaken, there were a total of 2 separate congressional hearings looking into his behavior at Sand Creek. One conducted by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War, and another by the Joint Special Committee on Conditions of Indian Tribes. And although they did find that Chivington, quote, surprised and murdered in cold blood the unsuspecting men, women, and children on Sand Creek, he still never faced justice. Not an iota of justice for slaughtering all those women and children. And neither did Major Anthony or Governor Evans. Oh, and by the way, just as Silas predicted, Chivington would do his level best to malign Silas's reputation during these hearings by labeling Soule as a coward, a thief, and a drunk. After the hearings were concluded, Chivington moved to Nebraska and worked as a freighter. I guess about the only highlight to this entire story is that his future dreams of political greatness were dashed. Unfortunately, though, he just kept on living. And after his son died in 1866, he seduced and married his own daughter-in-law. Of course, his new bride would leave his ass just a few years later due to Chivington being a damn deadbeat. According to his wife/daughter, quote, he skipped to Canada and left me without means of support. I had no desire to live with a criminal, end quote. Chivington would eventually move back to Denver, where he died in 1894 at the age of 73. And you better believe, all the way up until his death, he staunchly defended his actions, saying that he ordered the attack on Black Kettle's village in response to similar atrocities committed by the indigenous. Oh, and by the way, according to George Bent, Black Kettle was indeed flying the Stars and Stripes over his lodge. Bent said that he didn't see how any of the approaching soldiers could have missed it. Chivington knew exactly who he was attacking that day. He knew damn well that Black Kettle and his people wanted peace, and he did not give a fuck. You know, I get that war is hell. War makes men do some really horrible things. And I'm pretty sure for the vast majority of human existence, when we did go to war and conquer our enemies, we then just raped and pillaged whatever was left behind. That was the norm for centuries. I get it. So was slavery. And not just here in the United States, in every single continent on planet Earth. Rape, slavery, misery, murder, it was all commonplace. But you know, just because that's the way things were once done, doesn't make it right. You know, we also didn't use toilet paper for the vast majority of human history, or brush our teeth, or listen to podcasts. Just because something was done a certain way for a long time, doesn't make it the right way. We don't live in the Dark Ages anymore. Sand Creek didn't happen in ancient Rome or medieval Europe. People in the 1860s absolutely knew the difference between right and wrong. And I refuse to just explain away these atrocities by saying, war is hell. What are you going to do? I'm ranting now, but I think you get the drift, right? Go to war if you must. Destroy your enemies, burn their homes, and make orphans and widows out of their loved ones. But don't kill kids or rape women. I find it very hard to believe that that's a controversial stance. I don't think that's asking for too much. All right, I'll get off my high horse now. As for Silas's widow, Hersa, she would eventually remarry to a politician named Alfred Leah and pass away in 1879 at the young age of 34. But before she died, she and Alfred had a son they named Homer, and Homer Leah would go on to become a famous man in his own right. A sickly child who never grew over 5 feet tall, Homer was nonetheless extremely intelligent and somewhat of a genius when it came to geopolitics. As such, he traveled to China during the Boxer Rebellion and talked his way into becoming a damn general. He, too, would die fairly young at just 35 years of age. All right, now, before we go, as promised, I do want to address whether or not Silas was assassinated due to his testimony against Colonel Chivington, as is commonly believed. And if not, what possible motivation could Private Squire have had? Obviously, Silas was on Chivington's shit list. I think that much is a given. Also, something I haven't mentioned yet, but the day before that first hearing, the one that Silas testified at, Chivington publicly offered $500 to anyone who either killed an Indian or killed an Indian sympathizer. And $500 was a whole lot of money back in 1865. On one hand, it seems pretty obvious, right? Chivington labels Silas as a sympathizer. He publicly offers $500 to anyone who kills Indian sympathizers. There are at least 2 possible attempts on Silas's life, maybe more. And then finally, he's gunned down by Squire just months after testifying against Chivington. Then, when the guy who allegedly shot him was arrested, the guy who arrested him died under what seems like pretty mysterious circumstances. I don't know, man. I'm no detective, but it all seems pretty cut and dry. But then again, you must have evidence. And from what I can tell, not much evidence exists other than the circumstantial. Although Squire was a private in the Army, he was not a member of Chivington's 100-Day Regiment, nor was he a member of Silas's 1st Colorado. Squire did not take part in Sand Creek. Hell, truth be told, he didn't even enlist until after the massacre, by which point Chivington had already mustered out. We also know that Squire had previous run-ins with the law, possibly multiple run-ins considering an article published at the time of his arrest describing him as notorious. And even prior to Silas's death, he had been talking about deserting the Army. It could very well be that Squire just didn't want to get locked up again. And when Silas showed up, as he and his buddy were drunkenly firing off their guns, Squire just impulsively shot him. He then sobered up rather quickly and got the hell gone while he still had a chance. As for him being broken out of jail, I think that can be easily explained away by taking a look at his brother, noted archaeologist E.G. Squire. Apparently, old E.G. had a long history of bailing his little brother out of trouble. Even prior to Squire escaping from jail, E.G. was pulling all sorts of strings with everyone from generals and even the damn Secretary of War. And this is pure conjecture, but I can only assume that when they failed to act, E.G. took matters into his own hands and hired somebody to bust his brother out of jail. I don't know, man. I'm kind of torn on this one. For what it's worth, Silas's former commander, Major Wynkoop, did think that Chivington put Squire up to the killing. And so did another officer by the name of Samuel Tappan. Fun fact, at one point Sam Tappan was commander of Fort Garland and tasked with hunting down the murderous Espinosa brothers. I actually did an episode on them a very long time ago, but long story short, Tappan was successful in this endeavor. Or I guess I should say his tracker, the former mountain man Tom Tobin, was successful. Although one of the brothers had already been killed, Tom located the other, Felipe, along with his nephew, and dispatched both of them. He then cut their heads off and brought them back to Tappan as proof. In turn, Tappan sent the heads to Colonel Chivington. By the way, all of this occurred prior to Sand Creek. And Chivington had the absolute gall to chastise Tappan for quote-unquote unchristian behavior. Guess the pious son of a bitch didn't approve of cutting the heads off of dead outlaws, but apparently he was A-okay with killing Cheyenne babies and letting his soldiers rape dead women, so long as they weren't white. Anyway, what do you think? Did Colonel Chivington orchestrate Silas's demise, or did Squire act out on his own accord? Hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com and let me know what you think. Or was it option number 3? Was Squire telling the truth when he said that it was Morrow who killed Silas? I think we just assumed Squire was lying through his teeth, but hey, you never know. So which was it? Was Silas killed due to his testimony against Chivington, or did Squire and or Moreau act on their own? Once again, that's josh@wildwestextra.com. I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Okay, before we go, I would like to also quickly discuss the aftermath of Sand Creek. As pretty much everyone with a brain could have predicted, this slaughter only served to intensify the violence. Many of the peaceful Cheyenne were radicalized by Chivington's actions to decide to go on the warpath. So did their allies like the Lakota and Arapaho. On January 7th, just a little over a month after the massacre, they hit the town of Julesburg, Colorado. Although few people were killed, I think the total was less than 20, the warriors still managed to loot the town and make off with quite a bit of plunder. They'd return a month later and burn the remaining buildings to the ground and just keep on raiding. Make no mistake about it, massacre at Sand Creek caused many, many other innocent people to be killed. In the final days of January, all the way into early February, the Cheyenne and their allies struck ranches and stages along the South Platte. According to George Bent, the entire South Platte Valley was, quote, lighted up with the flames of burning ranches and stage stations. But the places were soon destroyed and darkness fell on the valley. End of quote. Believe it or not, Black Kettle did escape Sand Creek, and he did continue to seek peace for his people, even after the soldiers killed his wife. Sadly, he too would be cut down just 4 years later in yet another massacre. Actually, it was just 2 days shy of the 4-year anniversary of Sand Creek. He and his band were camped out in western Oklahoma when Custer came calling with the 7th Cav. As was the case with Sand Creek, we do not know the total number killed, but per eyewitnesses, many of the dead were women and children. And on and on and on it goes. You kill one of ours, so we'll kill one of yours. I don't know, but pretty sure that ain't what the hymnist meant when he sang about that circle being unbroken. On a more positive note, I don't know if this is still going on, but for years, there was something known as the Sand Creek Massacre Healing Run. It would start at the massacre site and then finish in Denver at the grave of Silas Soule. A descendant of some of the Cheyenne who died at Sand Creek, a guy by the name of Odo Braided Hair, had this to say on the final day of the run in 2013. We appreciate your support on this last day of our healing run, which is dedicated to Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joe Kramer. They were at the Sand Creek Massacre, but they didn't participate. They didn't shoot. They witnessed the massacre, then provided affidavits. If not for them, there might not be any Cheyenne and Arapaho here today. If they had done what they were ordered to do, there might not have been any Cheyenne and Arapaho who survived. Now, if you would like to learn more, whether it be about Silas's time in Kansas or there in Colorado, I would strongly suggest picking yourself up a copy of Tom Bensing's book, Silas Soule, A Short Eventful Life of Moral Courage. If you're itching for more true tales from the Old West, head on over to wildwestextra.com. And you can always find ad-free content over at patreon.com/wildwestextra. As always, your support is very much appreciated. Till next time, try not to go murdering a bunch of innocent people, okay? Don't cut off anyone's skin and wear it as a hat, and please, whatever you do, don't be like Colonel Chivington. Maybe give Deuteronomy a rest for a while and focus on the Sermon on the Mount. You know, all that woke stuff that Jesus said about turning the other cheek and helping the destitute and the widows and loving our neighbors. I don't know, just a thought. And remember, it takes courage to fight, but it also takes courage to stand up for what you believe in. Consequences be damned. All right, till then, adios.